We begin the discussion on an issue making headlines. In the aftermath of the coronavirus, will there be a new normal for global politics? The G7 summit convenes the leaders of the world's richest countries once a year to discuss global issues and economic policies. Made up of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, the UK, the United States and Japan, it's been a platform for multilateral cooperation since the early 1970s when it was first formed. And the host nation this year is the United States, but President Trump has called the group outdated, saying that it fails to reflect the contemporary world. He added that he'd like to invite South Korea, Australia, India and Russia, but this unconventional move has caused some controversy. To discuss this issue, we have joining us today Dr. Byoung-joo, Professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul, and Dr. John Nilsson-Wright, Senior Lecturer at the University of Cambridge and Career Fellow at the Chatham House. My first question to you, Dr. Kim. Reacting to President Trump's suggestion of expanding the G7 summit while excluding China, Beijing's foreign ministry and state-run media have expressed some skepticism there. How do you think the Chinese government is going to react? How do you think it will act in the months to come?
I'm sure we will continue to hear different words or maybe consistent words from Beijing, but I am aware that initial reaction from Beijing is something that kind of mildly surprised everybody. That is actually Beijing, as far as I know, has welcomed the move. And I guess the rationale behind it is that Beijing feels that the United States needs to go with multilateralism and, it has to go with the respect for the international institutions and rules and so on. And at this point, at least, Beijing seems to be making argument that, drawing more countries into the international cooperation or more systemized ways of working together is a good idea. So initial reaction from China, as far as I know, has been welcoming it. But however, by the down the road, I guess China could change its position and could add different words. So we'll need to be closely watching.
And Dr. Nilsson-Wright, President Trump's move to include Russia in the G7 meeting has triggered very negative responses from other G7 countries. How do you think this is going to play out?
Well, I think this is going to be an extremely difficult issue to resolve. Already the governments of Canada and my own government in the United Kingdom have been adamant that they oppose the return of Russia to the G7 framework. For reasons which I think are easy to understand, the question of Crimea dating from 2014 and the continuing deadlock over Crimea is a source of grave concern in terms of security issues. Specifically in the case of the United Kingdom, of course, the use of nerve agents on British soil in Salisbury to attack two former Russian emigres is a source of grave concern. And of course, the role of Russia in interfering in domestic elections remains a source of acute worry on the part of many countries. And of course, it bears mentioning that, of course, Russia's interference in the 2006 US presidential election should be a concern to the United States. And it raises interesting questions about why Donald Trump has sought to invite Vladimir Putin to the upcoming meeting. I think this question of Russia is going to be a major sticking point.
And Dr. Kim, well, President Trump hasn't really done himself many favors over the past few years with his America First policy, while China's narrative over the COVID-19 outbreak and recently its move to control Hong Kong, as well as its aggressive trade measures against Australia, for instance, throughout this pandemic, it's caused a lot of countries to become wary of China. Do you think either country, do you think they can get the backing that they need from these G7 countries and the +4?
That's going to be an enormous challenge, whatever they want, wherever they want to head with the global community. Both members of the so-called G2, they face enormous challenges, all because of the things that they've been doing domestically and internationally as well. Washington and Beijing, they share the blame. And of course, I'm not saying that the two countries are equal. There are certain countries where the people of the world share more values with, and other countries probably not as much so. But the fact is clear. And Donald Trump, if anything, in Washington, he is the president who has been elected by those people who have advocated about the isolationist stance of the United States. So therefore, more than ever before, the United States position is at a very difficult, juncture at this point. So we'll have to see how they're going to navigate through. But in terms of the G7 as a venue of cooperation, Donald Trump, 2018, I believe, was very critical about other members, and the Macron of France, and then Merkel, Germany. We've seen these key leaders not getting along very well with Trump. So G7 has not been a place where things have been going well so far. So United States particularly have a lot of catching up to do, and China, of course, has never been a part of G8 and G7. And then, of course, we have G20, which is a different kind of vehicle. But G20 was created in response to the 2007-2008 financial crisis. And since then, the body has not been working out in terms of producing much of the results at this point. So many eyes are watching in terms of, how the Trump proposal will fan out.
And Dr. Nilsson-Wright, of course, for the global community, upsetting trade ties with China is something that most countries would want to avoid, as most economies really are already fragile. So it looks like most governments, they're treading very delicately. And in this situation, how do you think South Korea should manage this juggling act?
Well, for South Korea, of course, the invitation from Donald Trump to join the G7 is a very welcome development. South Korea has, as I'm sure your viewers are well aware, long aspired to be represented at the highest tables of global politics. So the inclusion of the South Korean government in this meeting, if it's approved, will undoubtedly, I think, be a very pivotal moment for South Korea and for the government of Moon Jae-in. When it comes to balancing relations with the United States and China, this is going to be extremely difficult. For South Korea, its natural economic center of gravity is Beijing because of trade and investment ties. China remains, of course, very important in terms of any potential peace deal on the Korean Peninsula, which obviously matters very much for President Moon. And yet, at the same time, Donald Trump, as we've seen, partly, I think, as an effort to distract from his domestic difficulties over COVID-19, and now, of course, those appalling scenes of unrest in American cities, wants to single out China for international criticism, and he will be pushing, I'm sure, the South Koreans to align with him in trying to marginalize China. And there are, of course, ways in which he can try and emphasize this by reconfirming and strengthening the THAAD missile deployment in South Korea, a source of grave concern to Beijing, and, of course, a point of tension at the beginning of President Moon's term as president. These issues can be a wedge to try and create division between Seoul and Beijing. So it will take, I think, a lot of diplomatic agility, a lot of planning, and a lot of sophistication on the part of the Blue House to make sure that it can walk a fine line between these two countries.
And what's your opinion on this, Dr. Kim? How do you think South Korea should balance its ties with China and America?
There are certain things that Korea should be more sensitive towards China's sentiments and so on, but there are other issues where Korea should draw a very, very clear line in terms of national self-defense, for instance, and then this kind of diplomacy. China's favorite word is sovereignty, and China always emphasized that countries have their own right to determine their own destiny and so on. And, when Korea tries to defend itself in terms of defense capability, and when Korea tries to do its diplomacy, multilateral diplomacy and so on, Korea has to make it clear that there is no room for China to interfere, and Korea should make its own independent decision based on its consideration, its independent consideration of its own Korea's self-interest. So sometimes, as I said, Korea has to draw a clear line. And in this case of G7 participation, making it G11 or G12, Korea should, of course, under the surface, maybe Korea should not, maybe certainly Korea should have a close communication with Beijing, but on the surface, Korea should make it clear that this is a very much independent decision of its own.
And Dr. Kim, President Trump said that the G7 has an outdated system that doesn't represent the current international security situation. Do you think he's right? And do you think it could be a chance for middle power countries like South Korea to play a more active role in the world?
Right. You called Korea a middle power country, but I guess increasing number of people these days call Korea part of the advanced group these days. Korea, let's be reminded, Korea is a seventh member of so-called the 30-50 country, over 30,000 US dollar per capita income, and then population in a country of more than 50 million people here. So Korea is a major power indeed. And going back to your earlier part of the question of G7 being a proper vehicle for our time, absolutely not, I guess. It was back in 1973 when G6 was created, and then Canada joined, G7 was created. And that's what, 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago? That was a long, long time ago. And since then, of course, we remember after 2007, 2008 global financial crisis, Obama administration tried to create a bigger vehicle, G20. And now looking back, a lot of people believe that was a little bit too big in terms of adding some of the countries then, which may not be ready to make as much difference. So, setting aside the fact this is coming from the idea of Trump White House, the idea itself, I think, is a sound one to make the very important vehicle of international cooperation more up-to-date and relevant. The idea itself sounds like it makes a lot of sense at this point.
Well, the previous G7 summit, it ended with President Trump lashing out against Canada and also retracting his support for a joint statement. Dr. Nilsson-Wright, do you think also that the G7 system is outdated for this world? Do you think expanding it would mark an end to the current version of world order as we know it?
I don't think the current G7 system is outdated. So many international institutions need to be broadened to incorporate other countries and to reflect the shift in distribution of power globally. So as with the G7 and arguably with the United Nations, it needs to be broadened. The critical question here is whether Donald Trump really means what he says when he talks about developing a more representative organization. I mean, Korea, of course, is in a very good position to stress the benefits of multilateralism because, of course, that's been at the heart of much of its foreign policy strategy. But when it comes to specific issues, COVID-19, of course, South Korea's own experience will be extremely important in thinking about the agenda for the G7 or expanded G10, G11 meeting when it takes place in September, as we expect it will take place. And in that context, South Korea can have a really important role. Other areas which have been talked about include security. And in the security space, one of the challenges at the moment is we have different visions of security, the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy that is a strategy that the United States is seeking to develop along with partner countries such as Japan. South Korea, for good reasons, has been wary about getting involved in the Indo-Pacific strategy. Its natural geographical interests keep it, in a sense, more focused on the continental dimension. And the question of how you work with other, whether middle powers or rising powers or flexible powers, is a real challenge. We can see that in the tense relationship between South Korea and Japan. And it will depend very much on what that agenda is going to be looking ahead to the summit. Donald Trump has shown precious little ability to work with other countries. And I think one of the suspicions will be that this expansion is an attempt to dilute the influence and power of some of the European countries, particularly France and Germany. Donald Trump, I think, is resistant to work with. And so a lot remains to be seen in terms of what the man in the White House is really trying to do with this initiative.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up the discussion here, but it's been very insightful. Dr. Byoung-joo, Professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul, and Dr. John Nilsson-Wright, Senior Lecturer at the University of Cambridge and Career Fellow at the Chatham House. Thank you so much for joining the programme.
Thank you.
This is also where we end the show today. Thank you for watching.